Hello and welcome to the City Property Association's webinar on the future of the city. My name's Lisa Webb and I'm a Senior Planning Partner and Board Member of Gerald Eve and a Board Member of the CPA. Back in the summer, we had a webinar on the economic impact of COVID on the city and its ecosystem. And we had it at a time when we were coming out of the first lockdown. Since then, life felt like it was coming back to some sort of sense of normality in September, only for us to be locked down again. As we're coming out of the latest lockdown, we're going to look today at what is the future of the City of London, the future of the office place, and how the city can evolve and maintain its role as a global business centre. The City Corporation has published its London Recharge Report, which is a call for action to work together to make sure that London remains one of the best places in the world to do business, with a focus on openness, innovation and sustainability. And today we're going to talk to the panel about their thoughts on this and on the future. So firstly, this morning, we're going to have a market presentation from Faisal Durrani, who is Head of London Commercial Research at Knight Frank. And then Faisal will join a panel discussion on these topics with our other panelists, who are Harry Badham, UK Head of Development at AXA Real Assets IM and Vice Chair of the CPA, Catherine McCulloch, Head of UK Property at Merchant Land, and Trevor Good, a partner at Ashurst and CPA board member. As well as the panel discussion, there's going to be an opportunity for you to submit some questions, which I can put to the panel. And I understand there's also going to be some live polls on some of our themes of today, so it will also be good to get your feedback as we go. So I'll now hand over to Faisal, who will present his market update. Thanks, Faisal.
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning, everyone. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk you through the state of London's office, leasing and investment markets. But before I get to that, I thought it would be helpful just to reflect on some positive themes in the market. Next slide, please. So these are four things that we've identified that are reasons to be positive. First off, a number of vaccines have reached trial stage in the past few weeks. And in fact, overnight, we've seen Moderna seeking emergency approvals for deployment of its vaccine. And as a result, we believe that GDP will recover to pre-pandemic levels in 2022 instead of 2023, as originally expected. The new president-elect of the United States, Joe Biden, is expected to inject fresh momentum into the EU-UK trade deal talks as we come down to the wire. And just a point worth mentioning, when I looked over the weekend, Odds Checker put the chances of a UK-EU trade deal at 63%. Which is very much in line with our expectations. Also, since the start of the pandemic, we know that investors have been, for the most part, sitting on their hands, which means that they've amassed a significant amount of dry powder. And with the news of the vaccine rollout, which is expected to start happening from the first quarter of next year, we expect that Q1 will be the mother of all quarters, if you like, in terms of investment activity as investors start to deploy that capital. And finally, the Bank of England, we believe, has a significant amount of firepower still left up its sleeve. In fact, since the start of the pandemic, there's been more QE deployed since the GFC 10 years ago. So quite clear that the bank is very, very keen on making sure that it supports economic growth going forward. Next slide, please. So moving on to the market then, this graphic here shows you investment activity across London over the course of this year. You can see that during the third quarter, we came in just under £1.3 billion of investment turnover, which compares to a long-term average of £3.4 billion. However, Q3 saw almost twice the amount deployed compared to Q2, and we believe that was largely due to the lifting of the UK's lockdown restrictions, specifically the travel restrictions that were lifted towards the end of June. In October, we had £1.5 billion deployed into London's office market. And during the first 8 days of Q4, we had £1.2 billion spent on the office market in London. And when now up to £2.4 billion. So very much looking like we're on track to our long-term average. Next slide, please. So where is this money coming from. So these two pie charts here show you the split of investors by nationality for London and the city. For London for Q3, you can see that the vast majority came from Greater China, which includes Hong Kong, followed by investors from Europe and also investors from the Far East. For the city, it's been dominated by investors from Europe, followed by those from Greater China and the UK. What I will point out is whilst it does look like, at least in terms of proportion, European investors are dominating activity, in terms of absolute numbers, the amount invested by Europeans both in the city and London is very much in line with the long-term average. It's just that we've seen a slight drop off in activity from other markets. Next slide, please. Turning to leasing then, this graph here shows you 10 years worth of take-up activity across London. Unsurprisingly, it's down. In Q3, we had just over 1 million square feet of office space rented, which is the lowest on record in our 30-year series. Q2 was the second lowest on record. In the city, we saw a slight uptick in the third quarter of 17%, but that was down just to one significant deal. But even then, Q3 take-up in the city remains 63% below the long-term average. And this isn't surprising, given that businesses have paused relocation and expansion decisions as they reassess their occupational strategies with a view to allowing greater remote working going forward. Next slide, please. But one thing I wanted to do was to put London in a global context. Whilst we're all sat here in London or in the UK, blinkered by the media, it is important to realize that this phenomenon of a drop-off and take-up is happening everywhere else as well. Here we've got a range of cities, Paris, Sydney, and New York. And as you can see from that table, they too have experienced record low take-up this year at some point. Next slide, please. So how does 2020 compare? We've got two graphs here showing you take up in London and the city separately. If you look at the bars representing 2020, you'll see that we're just over 50% down for the first 3 quarters of this year, v last year. However, if we focus in on the green segments of those bars, you'll see that during Q1, activity was very much in line with the long-term average. And then COVID hit and the market basically paused. What these headline numbers do not show us, however, is that where we are seeing activity is in the pre-leasing market, which remains robust and strong and is being driven by the professional and financial services sectors. These are businesses who are taking a longer-term view on London and committing to space, and also the two sectors we expect will add the most net new jobs to the City of London and Westminster over the next 5 years. Next slide, please. We've also done some analysis around which sectors might have been impacted the most by the pandemic. So this graphic here shows you take up by sector for the first 3 quarters of this year. And in the bubbles, you've got the percentage change from Q2 to Q3. Unsurprisingly, it's red for most of them. However, for the finance and banking sector and the professional services sector, we've seen a rise or stabilization in take-up activity between Q2 and Q3, albeit we are talking about quite low volumes. And as I said before, these are the two sectors we expect will add the most new jobs to London's economy going forward. Next slide, please. In terms of availability, there's been a lot of talk about a rise in tenant release space, and I'll come on to that in a second. But this graph here on the right-hand side shows you that availability has indeed been rising. We're currently sitting at above the long-term average. But in terms of the proportion of the market that is made up of second-hand stock, that's currently at 49%. Compared to a long-term average of 68%. So still below the long-term average. Next slide, please. And if we were to zoom in specifically to second-hand stock, we were at 7.7 million as at the end of Q3. However, that is still 28% below the long-term average. Next slide, please. We've been tracking tenant release space since the start of the pandemic, and we know across London there's been about 2.1 million square feet of space released. About 600,000 of that was planned pre-COVID and as a result of mergers and acquisition activity. And the split between the city and the West End is about 1.3 million to the city and about 800,000 to the West End. We feel the impact will be greatest at sub-market level rather than a London-wide level, especially when you zoom in and look at where this space is being released. So it's not just the location and the quantum, but also the quality, because a lot of this space will be tired, old secondary stock that will be difficult to let. Next slide, please. In terms of rental performance, this graph here shows you rents across the main markets that we monitor in London for the last 10 years. And you'll see in the bubbles on the right-hand side that we've made downward adjustments in the third quarter, pretty much across the board. And these adjustments are based on negative market sentiment rather than transactional evidence, simply because the market has been weighed down by negative sentiment, and the government's flip-flopping advice on returning to work hasn't been particularly helpful. One thing to point out is that whilst it looks like prime headline rents have remained relatively stable, net effective rents have been declining as lease incentives have continued to drift. Next slide, please. Moving on to something slightly more positive then, before I finish, we're also tracking under offers. And at the moment, we've got about 2 million square feet of space under offer, and about half of that is coming from the finance and professional services sectors. And as I said before, these are the two sectors that have seen the greatest amount of stabilization and take-up, and also where the most new jobs are expected to be created. Final slide, please. And just to finish, a few things to think about in terms of upsides. The flexible office market seems to have had a little bit of a recovery in take-up during Q3. We're also seeing businesses look to the flexible market for solutions in how to handle their post-COVID occupational strategies. BP is a really great example of this, having given up what is arguably the best business address in the world at 1 St James's Square, and instead opting to take half the amount of space in Fitzrovia in a building entirely managed by TOG. In addition, all staff that work in that building will have day passes to TOG sites across London. The supply pipeline remains constrained. 44% of it is pre-let, and we know that one of the issues that will transcend COVID is the war for talent, and businesses have been mitigating against this by focusing on best-in-class space. And undoubtedly, the pandemic will lead to construction and fit-out delays, potentially further exacerbating that issue. We've also seen a re-gear starting to rise. So whilst overall transactional activity may be down, our London tenant rep team has provided anecdotal evidence that demand may be being stored up rather than being eliminated altogether as occupiers take a wait-and-see approach. And finally, investors clearly remaining very committed to London's office market. We've got about £3.7 billion worth of stock currently under offer. And even if half of that completes, that means we will achieve our long-term quarterly average as London continues to emerge as a global safe haven for investors. Thank you very much, and back over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Faisal. And I guess it's no surprise really that take-up is down, as you say, given the year that we've had this year. But it is good to end on your point about investors remaining committed, which leads nicely on to the first question to the panel, which is about the future of cities and the future of the city. I mean, there's been a lot of talk throughout this year in this pandemic about will people continue to work from home post the pandemic ending, and if so, will they be fleeing the cities to more rural locations? And the idea of satellite hubs has been gaining momentum. So is this going to happen, or what is the future of the city? So Harry and Catherine, it'd be good to hear from you from your different perspectives about what you think the future of the cities and specifically the City of London is. Both Harry as an international investor and Catherine from a sort of more SME perspective, and also how the city can retain its attractiveness for both international and domestic investors. So Harry, would you like to go first?
Certainly, thanks, and good morning, everyone. I think we look at trends here, and we've got a 10-15,000 year trend of people urbanizing. Ever since we first started settling in Mesopotamia 12-15,000 years ago, cities have grown ever bigger, and they've ebbed and flowed, but by and large the trend has been one of continual growth. And you look at the most successful cities, economies, cultures in the world, they're all centered around cities. And look, we believe, and our investors and our investment committees believe in kind of cities, city states. And we think London is one of those, whether you put it in the top 5 or top 3, it doesn't really matter. It's one of those world cities that is in that pack. When we think about our assets in Zone 1 London, you've got somewhere around 20 million people who can get there within an hour. And if anything, this trend for remote working. Look, we're in the most exciting phase any of us have seen about how real estate is going to be used over the next 3, 4, 5 years. It's really fascinating, and it's a humanizing period for real estate. But fundamentally, what drives cities to work is infrastructure and culture. It's not, it's not just a place to sit. What my friends at various of the tech companies, they used to call offices a place where they could keep their laptop dry. That is not the purpose of real estate. And I think this period we're going through is going to re-emphasize that actually people have got a choice. They've got a choice of what they do, how they do it. I personally believe very strongly that people will continue to come into cities. You look at the busiest place over May, June and July in the city when we were just sort of emerging from that first lockdown. The busiest place in the city was the Ned. People would go in specifically to meet. You look at Faisal's slides on leasing activity. Okay, a lot of that is due to uncertainty of economics and all the rest of it. But I warrant personally, and from our own experience, a very big reason why that take up is down is because we haven't been building relationships. We haven't been face to face with people. We haven't been transactions. Economies are built off people engaging with other people. And for me, that has to be in city centres. That has to be the basic real estate fundamentals, the place where the infrastructure is, the place where you can get most people, those kind of multi-use spaces that drive people to make the choice to come in. So I am very positive about cities, the continued success of cities, but I also believe that we're going to have to work 10 times harder to make real estate relevant.
Great, and thanks. And any thoughts on the city and how we can ensure that the city specifically retains its sort of attractiveness as a place for investment?
Yeah, I think for us, a lot of what's coming out now is around purpose, and we've seen the successful companies. You look up and down the high street, just as a good example. It's not that the high street is dead. It's just that there are a lot of companies out there who haven't kept pace with what consumers want. So for me, the city, and the city in particular of all the sort of central London districts, has got the power to be able to invent and innovate. The Recharge report we've just seen sets out a very clear purpose and an agenda for that. I think that's absolutely right. If we want the city to continue to do that, it's got to be quite radical about what really makes places work, and that means investing in learning, infrastructure, technology, all these things that effectively start at a grassroots human being level to get people to want to be there, to want to work, and to create value, productivity.
Great. Okay. And Catherine, the city is made up of a significant proportion of SMEs, and wants to grow this further. We know that from the documents that have been coming out from the city recently. It'd be interesting to hear your views and whether they marry with Harry's about the future of cities and the city in particular, and again, what the city needs to do to make sure it retains that sort of attractiveness.
Okay, good morning. I mean, I would echo what Harry says in terms of just confidence in the future of cities long term. But just turning to SMEs, it's interesting because Merchant Land, although we also own assets across Zone 1, we qualify as an SME in terms of turnover and team size. And I think that's quite interesting because it often surprises people. So do 95% of our commercial tenants, and they represent a huge range from startups to sort of very established businesses, second, third generation. They may be trading globally, locally, and across Europe. And I think when we talk about SMEs, it's important to recognise how much variety there is within the sector when we're thinking about attracting them and bringing. I think the aim with London Recharge is 20% of new tenants to be SMEs by 2025. Just to understand that's across a really broad range of businesses with different needs. And I'm imagining we also want these SMEs not to just be new office tenants, but retail and leisure as well, which are going to be so important for keeping vibrancy. I think with our customer base, and we're an SME business catering for SMEs, two of the big attractions that bring people into the square mile, and we're not the cheapest place to do business, would be the access to the talent pool. You've got access to talent across London. The mainline stations means there's plenty of people coming in. So there's a really, really good workforce there. And I think the CPA pointed out recently that 61% of the city workforce are under the age of 39. Now that's great, but I think we have to work hard to keep that in the future. Thinking about things like the cost of housing that's accessible to these workers. And I think trying to create an ecosystem where it pays for you to choose to build your career long term in the city, that you've got access to maybe world-class CPA opportunities that mean you choose to stay there rather than going to somewhere where perhaps cost of living is cheaper. Also, I mean, the second big driver, I think, for our customers is they're coming to do business in a place where there's clients and there's markets and partners, both in terms of actual physical proximity, but also to the transport links and digital infrastructure that mean accessing markets a bit further afield is easy as well. So I feel that kind of our role as landlords and developers is to contribute to this now with buildings that help facilitate that kind of attraction of talent and showcasing your business to your market in the future.
Great. And I mean, that actually leads on, doesn't it, to the question about office space and what are these offices that people investing and occupying in the city are going to be in. And I think it's fair to say the trends that we were seeing pre-COVID have only accelerated this year in terms of office space, and you're both bringing forward developments at the moment. Harry, further down the line at 22 Bishopsgate, and Catherine, you're in for planning at Church Lane. Could you just tell us a bit about what you're both doing in respect of office design to cater for this sort of new world that we're coming into? Harry, do you want
pick that up first? Yeah. Well, look, I think it's important to remember that what we're seeing now is not, we hear the words unprecedented a lot. Well, it's not really. I mean, we've had pandemics pretty much every every century for the last God knows how many thousand years. So it's not unprecedented. But what it is doing is accelerating what we've already. And look, I think we like to think that we're. One of the reasons we like development as an entity is because you can always create product that's right at the beginning of its life and is able to respond to the trends that are around at the time. But fundamentally, the trends for good real estate are the same trends that were around 100 years ago, which is what we call good bones. It's got light, air, space, open. That's whether it's a house, whether it's a coffee shop, whether it's a department store, or whether it's an office, the fundamentals are very, very similar, and good infrastructure, obviously. So taking 22 as a specific example, right at the outset, 2014, 15, when we were procuring that, we were investing a lot of money in floor to ceiling heights. So we've got 3-meter floor to ceiling heights, makes a huge difference to the volume of space and the way it feels. Off the back of that, we saw that we wanted to quantify that. So we started investing in the WELL certification. So we were the first European building to do that, and we will get that WELL shell and core enabled, which is proof that the airflow, air quality is of a standard, the water quality is of a standard, that the daylight is of a standard. And then it's right down to literally the things like, when we're serving food, because we've integrated food in our market as part of the offer. When we're serving food, we can't serve more than 30 grams of sugar in a drink. So you can't serve full fat Coke. It's little things like that all affect how spaces make you feel, make you perform. So I think we're going to see that becoming almost universal now on the most successful spaces. But then for us, the really exciting things and the things we're now investing more in is that how do you make a building more responsive on a day-to-day level? So, using technology, we've always had this vision of kind of rolling out an app for our buildings. We've now put that in place, but really specifically just to deal with access. I don't think people want to join an app for their building to have some sort of social network just because they happen to be in this person's building. I don't believe that for a minute. But if I can load an app up and it allows me to get in and out of the building without a magnetic pass card, and if it allows me to invite someone in, if it allows me to buy a coffee for my guest while he's waiting for me, that is makes things easier to use. So I think all these things at an asset level, just need to be more person-centered, which means each individual can, and it's the great thing that technology allows us to do. It's this sort of mass bespoking. Every single person can craft their own experience of a space. And somebody's day, which used to be much more regimented of, I commute, then I work, then I commute. It's now a sort of mass of things that all happen at once and almost happen over a 24-hour period rather than that sort of daytime, nighttime period, where, you're on the train, you're working. So your train, which if you're on GWR, we also own those trains. So, that's that we're renting offices there. We're not renting train travel. You just sort of got to reassert your mind. If you're buying a coffee from a coffee shop, you're in an office, or if you're meeting someone in the Ned, you're in an office. That's fulfilling very, very similar purposes. And this complete blending of uses that are going to be fundamental, and we've got to open our minds in real estate to how that kind of multi-use happens, because it's not just an office space. And look, I'm just a greedy developer. If it allows me to rent my space twice, great. You can have it Monday to Friday. You can have it Saturday and Sunday. You can have it after the hours of 7 p.m. A hotel can be an office. An office can be a hotel. I think it's this kind of, it's this sort of unlocking and unbundling and just making real estate multiple uses that just respond to how people want to use it. That's the really fascinating change that we can make.
Thanks, Harry. I mean, that comes back to one of your very first points about choice being so important these days, in terms of how people occupy buildings and what they want to do and how they want to work through their working day. Catherine, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Creechurch Lane in terms of
Yeah, sure. So Creechurch Lane is really typical of the kind of stock merchant land owns, which is a bit dog-ended, to be honest, a bit tired, heading in the wrong direction in terms of sort of slowly edging into decline. And so, before COVID, we knew, we needed to do something with the site going forward. And we've been aware, obviously with occupiers across all ends of the spectrum, people are much more concerned going forward about factors like ESG, about looking at their own sense of kind of duty to look at things like carbon reductions going forward. And I think with COVID, that's going to accelerate. Faisal mentioned that kind of flight to quality. But that's something that we're trying to kind of address with our assets, and we're looking at Creechurch Lane as a way to do that. So we've really tried to bring in factors that will harness the sustainability, health, and flexible working. We thought they were important before. We've been working on the project since 2017, but we've done some revisions this year because we think they're even more important. So to just give a feel, really, it's a medium-sized building we're developing. It's not big, it's not iconic. It's kind of under 100,000 square feet. We're making it work really, really hard. We've given over much of the ground floor mezzanine to cycle storage. And when we go through detailed design, we'll also have a little bit of a look at electric scooters as well with that. We've done public realm, or have put together a plan for public realm with the city, to create kind of seating and planting and a bit of a pocket park outside that will tie in nicely with the public realm created with One Creechurch Place. We're doing a full height all the way up the new building. There'll be a green wall with additional kind of planting across the terraces. So from the outside, before you even go into the building, when you journey in, we're doing things that are very, very different than the site that we bought 20 years ago. Inside, we try to work hard to make sure that each floor is flexible, the fit out's flexible, the space planning's flexible. And I think after this year, that's going to become even more pertinent, because I believe that businesses will respond differently going forward. I think some will return to doing kind of 5 days a week. Some will return and ultimately do very flexible patterns. And I think that our role as landlords is to support lots of different businesses to adapt to the patterns that suit them mid to long term. We've also provided outdoor space for each floor. We felt that that was important for well-being. The position of the outdoor space also combines things like natural ventilation and access to the greening that we've provided. So it's really, really nice space for kind of well-being. And yeah, I mean, I think these are all things we started and initiated a few years ago, but are paying more and more attention to now. I think what will be different is as we move into detailed design, we will look a lot more closely at smart technology. If I'm honest, I was a bit put off with the idea of the cost of it, just because of the size of the building. But we're looking at things where I think features like contactless entry, being able in a multi-let building where different tenants might have different occupancy trends in the future, having something to help the building managers look at how the building's occupied and tying that in to kind of some of the overall occupancy costs and energy consumption. I think those are things I don't know much about, but I'm going to make a concerted effort going forward through detailed design to look at closely.
Great, thanks, Catherine. And it'll be great to see it when it's delivered. It sounds very exciting, as is 22 and a lot of the other ones coming forward now. So we've had the results of our first poll, and it was pretty emphatic that the city's USP is agglomeration of skills, talent, and global business. So that's I think we've got another poll coming up later, so please do continue to participate. So turning to planning policy next. Trevor, if I can come to you on this. I mean, Harry was talking about the need for flexibility in terms of uses. Hotels and offices may be challenging a little bit in terms of where we are at the moment with the planning system, but you know, the planning system is changing. The government is bringing out its proposed reforms at the same time as making changes to the existing system, the use classes order, and the City Corporation has recently taken a report to committee with proposed changes to its city plan to take into account this changing planning context and also to take into account the trends emerging from the pandemic this year. Trevor, what role do you think planning policy can play going forward in terms of supporting the future of the city that we've just heard about from Harry and Catherine?
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning. So I suppose planning policy, it's at three levels. You've got national, regional, strategic, and local. And at the national level, we've seen the government take steps to protect the property industry, and that's in the form of the Business and Planning Act, which was introduced earlier this year, offering things like extensions to permissions, planning permissions, which are about to lapse, and listed building consents. For the construction industry, there was the deemed consent to vary site construction working hours, and looking at keeping the planning process moving forward, and the way in which measures were introduced quite quickly to allow appeals to continue in a variety of forms, and we see that at this moment in time with the Tulip appeal, with the Tulip public inquiry which is taking place. Other changes introduced by government, we had the temporary relaxation of the seal regulation, so it's afforded a discretion to local authorities to defer seal payments, disapply late surcharges and payment of interest, and to allow credit to developers who have already paid interest. And you know, that's aimed at SMEs, but an organisation like Catherine's will be, and many others within the city, would be very receptive to those changes. Alongside that, as you mentioned, Lisa, we have the changes to the use classes order, which were introduced at the beginning of September of this year. And so we have the removal of use classes A1, A2, A3, and B1, and the introduction of a new class E, which is this general commercial use class. and also the introduction of use classes F1 and F2. And there's been some protection afforded to pubs, cinemas, takeaways, moving them into a new category of sui generis, just affording them protection in terms of whether or not there's demand for their use, and just giving them the planning protection so that you need consent to change the use rather than just relying on the use classes order. Not sure how relevant it is to the city, but the introduction of new temporary permitted development rights to allow buildings, certain buildings to be demolished for new residential development. There are fairly strict limits in terms of size and height. And then alongside those concrete changes, as you've alluded to, Lisa, we have quite a bit of consultation going on at the moment. There's the planning white paper, and alongside that, there was the first homes consultation. Now, in terms of the planning white paper, that's an attempt by government to adopt a fairly radical reform of the planning system, saying that this is going to be the most significant change to the planning system over, since the Second World War, and based on the 3 pillars. We've had a number of sessions on the planning white paper, and the consultation period is closed. It's been a very mixed response, over 44,000 responses, so there's a lot of interest in that consultation process. The general feedback from the development community is that a lot of the change is very positive. It provides more planning certainty and a quicker decision-making process, and should theoretically depoliticize the planning process. But there's been a lot of pushback too, which is it too radical? Is there too much change proposed? And has there been proper consideration to the real implications of these changes? And what's the rationale for this one-size-fits-all approach? And a place like the city, the focus in terms of any planning reform isn't on housing. It's on how can you make provision to enable the city to become an even more attractive place to invest and to in which to do business. And in terms of the white paper, I think there's a realization by government that they're not going to achieve the timescales that were originally envisaged, and we're, I think, going to see a sort of staged introduction of the measures that are proposed, and it's likely that the reform of the local plan process will be pushed back towards the end of this Parliament. But there will be some changes that could be made relatively quickly, such as the digitalization of the planning process, alongside looking at the community infrastructure and the introduction of the new infrastructure levy. And so there are some positive changes that can be made fairly soon. At the regional strategic level, we have the London Plan, and there's been this really strange impasse really between the Secretary of State and the Mayor of London. The Secretary of State published a fairly damning letter to the Mayor of London, commenting on the plan. But when you actually read the letter and look at the changes proposed, they were not particularly extensive. Things like Greenbelt policy and the approach to SIL, strategic industrial land. But that's resulted in this impasse. And so we've got a plan for London, which is ready to be adopted, but the Mayor, the GLA, are awaiting the green light from the Secretary of State for that to happen. But that hasn't deterred the GLA, the Mayor of London. They recently published further guidance and are consulting on that. So this guidance will underpin the operation of the London Plan as and when it's adopted. And so in terms of the local level, the city plan, we had the Regulation 19 pre-submission consultation draft, which was approved back in May of this year. Then the city realised that there were difficulties in terms of embarking on that consultation process. And so that was delayed. But in reality, that delay has been to the benefit of the city because, as we know, last month, the Planning and Transportation Committee looked at further changes to the plan to address the changes to PD rights and the use classes order, and also to pick up on some of the impacts of COVID-19. And alongside that, it's been an opportunity for the city to focus on its climate change ambitions and ensure that some of those policies are going to be incorporated in the plan. So that consultation process will now start, and we should hopefully have a new city plan in place by the end of next year. And what are those changes? Just focusing in a bit more detail, we've got the within the context of the use classes order, there's a desire to have greater protection of office accommodation. And on the retail side, although we've got the sort of the retail areas and the retail links, there's still a need to have sufficient control over the greater flexibility which has been afforded by the changes to the use classes order. Now the city, it's still seen as a very attractive place in which to do business and to respond to new ways of working. And one of the areas, and Harry's alluded to this, it's understanding the impacts of COVID on the retail and hospitality sector, and how can greater flexibility be introduced to accommodate and respond to the needs of those sectors. And then finally, we have the, as you said at the beginning, Lisa, we've got the London Recharge Report. And that's being produced by the city in partnership with the Oliver Wyman and Arup. And that's focusing on the need to deliver a more diverse and representative workforce that makes best use of London's talents. And Catherine's already picked up on that, but it's a common theme throughout what we've all been saying this morning, which is making the use of the opportunities that are presented by the pandemic within the context of the infrastructure that's already in place in the city.
Thanks, Trevor. And just picking up on a couple of those points. I mean, I think the conversation that we've had so far about the sorts of spaces and the sorts of city that we need to see going forward to retain attractiveness is very much picked up in the city's report on some of the changes it's looking at making to the city plan, focusing on flexibility, focusing on a healthy and inclusive city, adaptable workspaces, for innovation, for startups, vibrant ground floor uses, which we've picked up already, culture, which we may come back to as being an important attractor to the city, which can be positively supported through the city plan and sort of add to that diversity of what the city offers. An emphasis on public realm and also on well-being, which both Harry and Catherine picked up on specifically. So I think there's a lot in there which is chiming with what we're seeing on the ground, so to speak. And Trevor, just on the white paper, I think the CPA members will probably know that we submitted representations to the white paper plan around actually how it works for London, and it'll be interesting to see what happens as it sort of goes through its process, because as you say, it was very much focused on housing, and from a CPA and the city's perspective and London's perspective, there was concern about how relevant it was for London, and actually would it have the benefits that it was aiming to achieve, or would it have unfortunately the opposite, given it's not been sort of factored into it at this stage. So yeah, a lot going on the planning front, and hopefully it'll keep keep delivering what we need it to deliver in order to meet the aims that we need it to do so. Faisal, I'll just come back to you actually in terms of the pipeline coming forward in the city. We know that the Planning and Transportation Committee has been incredibly busy during pandemic and has been approving major schemes such as New Tower at 50 Fenchurch Street and other major office schemes such as Millennium Bridge House, the BT Centre and more recently 150 Aldersgate Street. And we also know that the City Planning Department is still very busy with current applications and pre-application discussions. You mentioned construction delays, Faisal, earlier in your presentation, and we know that starts on site are down this year. But can you tell us a little bit more about what the pipeline's looking like going forward?
Sure, Lisa. Just before I come on to that, I wanted to pick up on a couple of points that Catherine and Harry made on the future of the office. COVID-19 has, undoubtedly irrevocably changed the definition and purpose of an office. Businesses and indeed sectors are still feeling their way through the COVID-induced fog as they embrace greater remote working and determine how best to incorporate this into their occupational strategies. And I guess one thing's for certain, there won't be a one-size-fits-all solution. And in parallel to that, offices are no longer going to be email factories, if you like, nor will they be administrative farms. What COVID has delivered is really the greatest shakeup in the way in which commercial office space is being used in decades. Offices will become places of true collaboration and innovation, places where careers are made. They will be showrooms to allow businesses to showcase themselves to future talent and indeed potential clients. And as far as we're concerned, the talent piece is especially important. As I mentioned earlier, it's an issue we believe will transcend the pandemic. And in our 2020 London Landlord and Investor Survey, it was cited as the #1 concern by businesses to landlords. And as I said before, the way businesses have been mitigating against this is by occupying the very best space they can possibly get their hands on, ensuring that the workplace experience takes center stage. And when we all begin our great migration back to the office, and we will, our expectations will be higher than ever. We will want the very best offices for ourselves. We will want space that enables us by being temples of wellness, green prowess, and digital connectivity. And coming back to your original question, as at the end of Q3, we were tracking 7.6 million square feet of development across the City and South Bank markets. And 4 schemes in total account for 43% of that total. And the total stock being built in the City and South Bank equates to about 60% of all office development across London. And off that total, about 2/3 is being built speculatively, with 1.3 million square feet due in 2021, a further 1.1 million square feet due in 2022, and about 360,000 square feet or so due in 2023. And just separately, and bearing in mind some of the factors that we've all been talking about, one of the key statistics that we've recently uncovered is the fact that 64% of London's office stock was actually completed prior to the year 2000. So notwithstanding refurbishments over the last 20 years, there is a lot of older, tired stock out there. And if these buildings are not modernized and or greenified, if you like, in some way, they risk being discounted by occupiers and investors alike. However, therein probably lies one of the biggest opportunities in our market to invest in these buildings and deliver products that match current occupier expectations. And that aside, what the age of building stock in London tells us is that occupiers are all likely to be concentrating their attention on a very small segment of the market, which remains in short supply. And here I'm talking about the very best grade A space. And this is where we've seen rents hold reasonably steady. And this is where we expect demand to continue remaining laser focused.
Okay, thanks, Faisal. We've just had a poll come up while you were speaking about initiatives for the city to ensure its success going forward. So just to conclude the panel discussion before we see whether there's any questions from those watching, it'd just be interesting to go around each of you, if that's possible, and just ask what you think, which innovative thing you think the city or the real estate sector should be focusing on going forward to sort of really ensure the city's success coming out of the pandemic and into the future. So I'm going to go round in terms of the order I've got you on the screen at the moment. So Catherine, if I could go to you first.
Okay, no, very, very quickly, I think on the back of the new Centre of Music, or Centre for Music, the Culture Mile, and the new task force that's been set up about culture and commerce, I think bringing, attracting visitors and, you know, daytime and nighttime into the Square Mile would benefit a lot from live music, live theatre, not on a large scale, but in make use of some of the pocket parks and new public spaces that we have. I've noticed that in cities I spend a lot of time in, Belfast, Glasgow and Edinburgh, that if you have high quality, you're curated, not someone you're busking singing James Blunt hits, but good quality live music that's been kind of screened to be there. People hang around and enjoy being there. And I think we have to work hard to bring people back. Yeah,
absolutely. Faisal, you're next on the order.
So I've talked about development, but one area I feel that is an opportunity we are yet to fully embrace are mixed use schemes. These are prevalent elsewhere in the world, and by having a good use and mix of residential, we could in theory be able to foster richer, more diverse communities, and certainly the centre of London could benefit from this. I mean, look, don't get me wrong, London is a magnet for talent and businesses already. In fact, in our recent active capital research, we found that London was the world's most innovative city in a study that involved 288 locations around the world. And this innovative standing fosters office demand and comes in addition to our economic agglomeration benefits and arguably the richest talent globally, thanks to our excellent educational infrastructure. And I only mention these issues because I don't think we can rest on our laurels. Aside from mixed use development, the other significant area I feel, which we've touched on a couple of times, is ESG, but the focus has been on the E element for some time. I think we also need to look at the S element, the social aspect. How can we embrace technology in a more meaningful way to make our buildings and experiences therein richer? What can we be doing to improve our broadband capacity and speeds? And these experiential issues will, may be intangible, but are critical. And I think especially important as we enter the 20s.
And that goes back to something Harry was talking about a bit earlier. Trevor?
Well, I agree with what Faisal has just been saying about mixed use developments. And, the pandemic has shown that a number of the local centres where people live, shop, and have their entertainment are thriving through the pandemic. The city's housing targets, 146 units per annum within the context of its size, is to some a very low figure. There must be scope for looking at ways of increasing the numbers and delivering more housing in the city, whilst at the same time maintaining its importance as the commercial capital of London.
Yeah, we talked, there was a question about this on the previous webinar we had, and the city's position, as we know, is that it has its residential clusters and very much supports those, but seeks to retain the core of the city as sort of primary business area. But there is, I guess, residential in the clusters and in the surroundings. But I take your point. I mean, it's certainly very noticeable when you're working from home that the neighbourhoods are much busier than the centre of London at the moment, and has been throughout the year. Harry?
I get to round it off, do I?
You do.
Well, listen, I think it's quite easy. You just charge people business rates on their houses if they're using them as an office, right? And you probably have to figure out some means of teleportation to get people to the office without using public transport in the short term. So once you solve those two, the rest of it should be easy. Now, joking aside, I think that the thing that is changing rapidly with the city is this, and Faisal, you touched on it, is the S bit of ESG, is kind of how do we make a city where everyone feels comfortable and wants to be. We've supported initiatives like Sculpture in the City, like Archie Kids, which opens the city to people who otherwise wouldn't be there. And I think that for me is the biggest thing, is that jobs in the city, work in the city, being in the city shouldn't be some sort of exclusive club. It shouldn't feel alien to people, whatever background, whatever education, whatever career dreams they have. It's kind of creating the opportunities there, and that comes through learning, education, technology, whatever it is. That's kind of creating an inclusive city. And you know, there's a lot of movement going on around the world around 15-minute cities. Again, we've sort of touched on that kind of mixed use. For me, it's more multi-use, by the way. Mixed use is sort of like, is kind of planner speak for that's that use and that's that use. What am I in now? I'm in C3, right? But hold on, I'm using it as an office. So how can it be C3? So maybe I got it C1. I'm not very good with the planning use class, at least, before you look at me like that. But my point is, let's not be constrained by the letter of some of these things. Let's think about the spirit of these things. What do we actually want city centres to be doing, and who do we want them to be accessible to? And let's let people make the choice about how they use these spaces, for which jobs, for which roles, but create a sort of inclusive atmosphere that doesn't fend people away and invites people in, whether that's to learn, to progress their career, to meet people, to socialize. You know, don't forget, a lot of people come into work to socialize. So does that mean that we need to change B1 to or E, whatever we call it now? I mean, is it, if I go into our canteen and have a cup of coffee, does that this whole use classes thing? Or for me, it just needs a kind of rethink about what it really means. And fundamentally focus on people and what they want and how they get it out of a city or a place.
Thanks, Harry. And that's what people watching here today also have also think as well, because in terms of our poll, the diversity of the occupier base of the city and in terms of as well more startups and SMEs was definitely quite a long way top in terms of what initiatives people think will best support the city's recovery. So really changing making it a more diverse place, a more interesting place. And the next one was open spaces and reduction in traffic. And I think I absolutely can see that. And one bit I thought was quite interesting in the London Recharge report was about active travel and green arteries to encourage people to walk and run and get around the city and London generally in a much more pleasant way than perhaps we have up till now. So we are very nearly out of time, but we do have one question which we can put to the panel, which is from Paul Beckett from the City. I don't think he'll mind me saying it's from him. So question to whichever of our panelists wants to take it. It's, will the city benefit from flight to quality as some fringe markets retrench in the short term? Who'd like to answer that?
I'll give it a go. We developed a building. We developed a building on Holborn Viaduct 5-6 years ago, and all the agents said, well, it's a bit fringe. Can we change its postcode from E1 or EC1 to EC3? I can't remember which postcode it was. It's a bit fringe. Don't really like it. It's like, it's on Holborn Viaduct, guys. It's on Central Line that way, and Farringdon there. So I think that this concept of fringe is a bit, I've always found a little bit of a queer one. It's like, it's zone one, all right? Zone one is zone one. Occupiers don't think about fringe or location. They want to buy into a place that feels appropriate to their business. I do think though, that the point of the question, quality will outshine all, and quality of providing the right environments, you've got to, next year we're going to have to convince people to come back to the office. It's going to be a job, and to get people to do that, there's going to be a level of quality in whether it's the space or the journey to work or whatever it is. That's absolutely fundamental, that quality will shine through.
Thanks very much. And I think that's been sort of the key message for today, really, is that quality and providing this diversity of uses and this will to really get people back into the city and wanting to be back in the city. And I'm sure that will happen, and policy will support it in doing so. So thank you very much to Faisal for your presentation, and to all the panel members today for what I think has been a really interesting discussion, and to everyone who tuned in and listened and took part. Just a reminder that you can access this and all of the previous CPA and London Property Alliance digital engagement content on the CPA website. So thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.